The secret of illusion of productivity waking up at AM is usually presented as a productivity technique, a discipline strategy, a success habit, a way to gain advantage over other people, but psychologically, the behavior often represents something deeper. Most individuals are not simply trying to become productive. They are trying to regain control over a life that feels internally disorganized. Modern life fragments attention constantly. Notifications interrupt thought. Social comparison never stops. The mind becomes reactive instead of intentional within this condition. The early morning begins to feel psychologically symbolic. IT represents order before chaos, silence before stimulation, control before external demands take over attention. This is why people become emotionally attached to the habit so quickly. The routine is rarely just about efficiency. IT becomes psychological structure. And beneath modern productivity culture exists a hidden reality. Many people are not chasing success. They are resisting internal disorder. Chapter 2. The fear of passive existence. Eternal psychology argues that modern individuals are not only afraid of failure, they are afraid of passive existence. Failure still implies action. Passivity implies unconscious living. Modern culture intensifies this fear continuously. Every platform displays progress. Every timeline creates comparison. Time itself begins to feel competitive. As a result, many people develop identity anxiety. The fear that life is moving forward without them participating consciously. This is why falling behind feels emotionally powerful, even when people cannot clearly define what they are behind in. The fear is not purely financial or professional. It is existential. Waking up at AM becomes psychologically associated with movement and intentionality. The individual feels separate from passivity, while others remain asleep. The person experiences action before the world fully begins. The habit creates the sensation of resisting unconscious existence itself. Chapter 3. Why the morning feels different. The psychological power of early morning is not mainly biological. It is environmental. External noise temporarily disappears. Notifications stop. Social expectations weaken. Digital stimulation decreases. For a brief period, the mind encounters cognitive silence. This is psychologically rare in modern life. Most people spend their days reacting continuously. Thought becomes fragmented. Attention becomes externally controlled. But early morning interrupts this pattern. The silence changes awareness itself without distraction. Internal states become more visible. Anxiety becomes noticeable. Mental disorganization becomes harder to ignore. Emotional instability surfaces more clearly. This explains why many people initially feel uncomfortable during early mornings. Silence removes psychological concealment. The individual temporarily encounters the self without constant external stimulation, and for many people, that exposure feels unfamiliar. Chapter 4. The ritual of control. Humans naturally seek structure to defend against uncertainty. Morning routines function as behavioral rituals. At first, the actions seem simple: wake up, exercise, read, sit quietly. But repetition changes the psychological meaning of these behaviors. The routine begins representing control itself. Each repeated action reinforces internal order. Over time, the habit stops functioning as scheduling. It becomes identity reinforcement. The person no longer thinks, "I wake up early." The internal narrative changes into, "I am disciplined." This shift is psychologically important, because once behavior becomes identity, breaking the routine feels like personal regression. The morning ritual becomes more than organization. It becomes existential self-maintenance, a repeated attempt to create order inside uncertainty. Chapter 5. The hidden ego behind discipline. Modern discipline culture often transforms self-control into status. Waking up early becomes associated with superiority. Productivity becomes moralized. Exhaustion becomes proof of seriousness. At this stage, discipline stops functioning purely as internal structure. It becomes identity performance. The individual unconsciously uses behavior as evidence of worth. Existential psychology warns about this shift, because behaviors originally designed for self-awareness can slowly become ego construction. The routine is no longer maintained for clarity. It is maintained for validation. This creates psychological distortion. The individual begins comparing discipline constantly. Who wakes earlier? Who works harder? Who appears more controlled? And eventually, discipline itself becomes exhausting. Not because the routine is difficult, but because the identity attached to it requires constant protection. Chapter 6. Why most people fail. Most people fail to maintain AM routines because motivation alone cannot sustain behavior. Temporary emotion can initiate change, but sustainable discipline requires identity consistency. If the individual still internally identifies as distracted, passive, or fragmented, the routine eventually collapses. Behavior cannot permanently outrun self-perception. This is why motivational intensity fades so quickly. At first, the routine feels transformative, but once emotional excitement disappears, the individual confronts internal contradiction. The disciplined behavior no longer matches identity, and psychological resistance begins. Existential psychology emphasizes that humans seek alignment between action and self-concept. Without alignment, discipline becomes psychological conflict, and conflict eventually produces fatigue. This is why sustainable habits depend less on motivation and more on internal coherence. Chapter 7. The existential meaning of waking yearly. From an existential perspective, waking up at AM is not fundamentally about productivity. It is about conscious participation. Modern life conditions people toward reactive existence. Attention becomes externally directed, behavior becomes automatic, time becomes consumed unconsciously. The early morning interrupts this process. Before stimulation fully begins, consciousness briefly regains autonomy. The individual experiences a rare psychological condition, intentional awareness before distraction. Without notifications or social pressure, attention becomes more deliberate. Actions feel chosen rather than reactive. This is psychologically significant because modern systems continuously encourage passive consumption. The early morning temporarily creates distance from those systems, and within the distance, people often experience something increasingly rare, the feeling of consciously entering their own existence. Chapter 8. Final reflection. The psychology of AM is not ultimately about success. It is about resistance against psychological drift. The habit attracts modern individuals because it creates the feeling of entering life deliberately instead of accidentally. But the deeper transformation does not come from waking early itself. A routine alone cannot create meaning. A schedule alone cannot stabilize identity. The real psychological shift occurs when individuals understand why silence, structure, and intentionality feel necessary in the first place. At that point, the habit changes meaning completely. It stops being performance and becomes an attempt to preserve conscious participation inside a world built around distraction. Perhaps that is the real reason the habit remains psychologically powerful, not because waking early guarantees achievement, but because it symbolizes something modern life rarely provides: intentional existence before the noise begins.